The church was already full when Dean Martin arrived, yet the sound that followed him was not the murmur of admiration he had known his entire adult life, but a hush so deep it felt like the building itself had drawn a breath and held it. It was the same silence that had followed him weeks earlier, after the private phone call that ended with him standing alone in his dressing room, still holding the receiver, unable to sit down, unable to speak, knowing that the one voice that had always grounded him was gone. This funeral was not the beginning of grief. It was its second act. The first had happened quietly, away from cameras, when he realized that success had not granted him immunity from the most ordinary human loss. His mother, Angela, the woman who taught him restraint, loyalty, and how to stand straight in a world that preferred Italians to bow, would never again answer his calls. And now, in this place of stone and stained glass, the weight of that truth pressed harder than any spotlight ever had. Dean moved slowly down the aisle, not because he was weak, but because he was careful. Careful not to let the tremor in his chest show in his hands. Careful not to rush past the memories rising with each step. He remembered her in Cleveland, small kitchen, apron dusted with flour, speaking Italian when she was proud and English when she was practical, telling him that dignity was not loud, that a man did not need to shout to be heard. These memories had followed him into adulthood, into nightclubs and film sets and television studios, shaping the calm authority people mistook for indifference. Those who truly knew him understood that it was discipline, not distance. And now, as he reached the front pew, that discipline was being tested in a way no studio executive or columnist ever could. The injustice revealed itself quietly, the way the most painful ones often do. Dean noticed it not in words, but in placement. His mother's casket had been positioned slightly off-center, not where prominent families were usually laid to rest. The priest, eyes flicking nervously toward the back, avoided Dean's gaze. A subtle, almost apologetic explanation came later, whispered by a parish assistant who clearly did not want to be the messenger. There had been concerns, he said. Concerns about the crowd, about the name, about the optics. Too much attention, some church elders had decided, might disturb the sanctity of the service. Others, less careful with their language, had used an older word Dean had heard his entire life, one that followed Italian families like a shadow, implying they did not fully belong. Even in death, his mother had been placed slightly aside, her dignity quietly negotiated away by men who believed power could be exercised without being spoken aloud. Dean did not react immediately. He sat through the opening prayers, his face composed, his posture straight, hands folded not in submission, but in respect for the woman being honored. Those who watched him closely noticed something else, though. His stillness was not passive. It was gathering. The room itself seemed to sense it, the air tightening as if waiting for a cue. When the priest spoke of humility and service, Dean listened, but his thoughts moved elsewhere, to the countless dinners his mother had hosted where everyone, regardless of status, was seated at the same table, to her insistence that no one was above another when it came to grief. By the time the eulogy approached, the injustice had become unbearable not because it was loud, but because it was so carefully disguised. When Dean stood, it was not dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no raised voice. He simply rose, adjusted his jacket with the same calm precision he used before walking on stage, and turned slightly toward the officiant. The priest hesitated, unsure whether this was permitted, and in that pause the power dynamic shifted. Dean did not ask permission. He did not accuse. He spoke softly, his voice carrying not because of volume, but because of clarity. He said that his mother had lived her life teaching respect, and that respect did not recognize hierarchy in sorrow. He said that if her place in death suggested she was less deserving of honor, then the room itself was mistaken. And then he added a single sentence, measured and unthreatening, that landed heavier than any confrontation could have. He said that if his mother could not be mourned with full dignity here, he would carry her memory elsewhere, and the silence that followed would speak louder than any headline. No one interrupted him. The men who had quietly arranged the seating avoided eye contact, suddenly aware that their authority had no shelter in that moment. The priest cleared his throat, visibly shaken, and nodded. Without explanation, without ceremony, the casket was repositioned, centered beneath the altar, exactly where it should have been from the beginning. The correction was simple, almost mundane, but the emotional shift was profound. It was not just a matter of wood and placement. It was the restoration of a woman's worth, acknowledged in front of everyone who had doubted it. As Dean returned to his seat, something in the room broke open. Not chaos, but release. A woman in the back wiped her eyes. A man near the aisle lowered his head, ashamed. The priest's voice, when he resumed, carried a sincerity it had lacked before. The service continued, but it was no longer burdened by quiet cruelty. It moved with honesty now, guided by the gravity of loss rather than the fear of attention. Dean remained composed throughout, but those closest to him noticed the subtle change in his breathing, the way his shoulders finally lowered, as if he had been holding something aloft and had at last set it down. Afterward, there were no speeches, no press statements. Dean stood alone for a moment by the casket, his hand resting lightly on the polished surface, his expression unreadable to those who did not know him well. To the outside world, he would always be the man with the effortless smile, the relaxed voice, the image of ease. But in that moment, stripped of performance, he was simply a son who had ensured his mother was seen as she had taught him to see others. Equal, worthy, unafraid. The injustice had not been dramatic. It had not made headlines, but its correction echoed far beyond the walls of the church. Those who witnessed it carried the memory quietly, understanding that true authority does not announce itself, and that dignity, once reclaimed, has a way of settling into a room and refusing to leave. Dean Martin walked out into the afternoon light without looking back, grief still heavy, but something else restored. And in the silence that followed him, his mother's lesson remained, intact and undeniable. The days after the funeral unfolded with a strange stillness, the kind that follows a storm no one else realizes has passed, and Dean Martin moved through them with the same composed grace he had shown inside the church, even as something inside him remained unsettled. Part one of this story had ended with restored dignity and public silence, but grief is never linear, and justice, once tasted, often sharpens the awareness of how often it is denied. Dean returned to Lowe's Angels carrying his mother's rosary in the pocket of his coat, a small weight that reminded him of where he came from and what he owed to that origin. Hollywood welcomed him back with rehearsals, scripts, and carefully worded condolences. Yet beneath the surface, the industry's old habits remained unchanged, quietly cruel in ways that rarely made noise. It was during a rehearsal for a televised tribute special, meant to honor classic American music, that the new conflict revealed itself. Dean arrived early, as he always did, not out of anxiety, but respect for the people working around him. The studio buzzed with activity, stagehands adjusting lights, musicians tuning instruments, producers scanning clipboards with practiced impatience. When Dean's name was mentioned, the room shifted subtly, a mixture of admiration and calculation. He was no longer just a performer here. He was a symbol, and symbols made executives nervous. As he reviewed the running order, he noticed an omission that felt deliberate rather than accidental. A segment celebrating immigrant influence on American music had been quietly removed, replaced with something safer, blander, more marketable. Dean did not need to ask why. He had lived his entire career understanding that acceptance often came with conditions. The producer, a polished man with a smile trained to deflect rather than engage, explained it with rehearsed calm. The network, he said, wanted to avoid controversy. Certain sponsors preferred a cleaner narrative. Too much emphasis on ethnic roots, on struggle, might alienate viewers. Dean listened without interruption, his expression neutral, his eyes steady. He thought of his mother again, of her accent that never fully disappeared, of the way she had been treated as less than American by people who benefited from her labor without ever acknowledging it. He thought of the funeral, of how easily dignity had been negotiated away until he had quietly refused the bargain. The injustice here was less visible, but it carried the same message: gratitude without credit, belonging without acknowledgement. Rehearsals continued, but Dean's attention drifted. He watched younger performers move through their cues, eager, talented, unaware of the compromises being made on their behalf. He recognized himself in them, the early years when he had laughed off insults, softened his name, adjusted his image to fit a narrower definition of success. That strategy had kept him employed, but it had also cost him something he only now understood fully. By the time the dress rehearsal ended, Dean had made a decision, not out of anger, but clarity. The turning point was not explosive. It came quietly, the way his most consequential moments always did. When the producer approached him afterward, expecting minor notes or polite approval, Dean spoke with the same measured tone he used on stage, calm and unhurried. He said he would not participate unless the segment was restored. He did not threaten, did not raise his voice, did not invoke his star power explicitly. He simply stated that the story being told was incomplete without acknowledging where the music came from, and that he would not lend his presence to a version of America that erased the people who built it. The producer attempted persuasion, then reassurance, then mild pressure, each tactic softer than the last. But Dean remained still, his refusal unwavering. The room grew tense. Executives conferred in whispers, weighing ratings against principles they rarely had to confront directly. Dean waited, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed, as if this were merely another scheduling matter. That composure unsettled them more than outrage ever could have. They understood, suddenly, that he was not posturing. He was prepared to walk away, not as a gesture, but as a boundary. In that moment, the balance shifted again, just as it had at the funeral. Power, stripped of noise, revealed its true shape. The segment was reinstated before the night was over. No announcement was made, no apology offered. It simply returned to the schedule, placed exactly where it belonged. On the night of the broadcast, Dean delivered his performance with quiet brilliance, his voice carrying decades of history without ever naming it outright. When the restored segment aired, The audience response was immediate, not explosive but deeply felt, letters arriving in the following weeks from viewers who saw their own families reflected on screen for the first time. Dean read a few of them, then placed them carefully in a drawer, not as trophies, but reminders. Part two of this story did not end with applause or headlines. It ended with something rarer, a sense of alignment between who Dean Martin was and what he allowed the world to take from him. His mother's lesson echoed again, not in words, but in action. Dignity, once defended, demands consistency. And as Dean walked off that stage, the weight in his pocket felt lighter, not because grief had faded, but because he had honored it in the only way that mattered. Part three began not with confrontation, but with isolation, the quiet kind that settles around a man when the room still welcomes him, but the doors begin to close more slowly. Dean Martin felt it first in small delays. Calls returned a day later than usual, meetings postponed without explanation, invitations softened with uncertainty. Hollywood was polite about punishment, especially when dealing with someone too respected to attack openly. The industry did not rebuke him for restoring dignity at his mother's funeral or for insisting on truth during the broadcast. It simply adjusted around him, the way institutions always do when a man reminds them that compliance is not guaranteed. Dean did not complain. He had never confused access with worth. He filled his days with work, recording sessions that required no approval, evenings at home where silence felt less like absence and more like recovery. Yet beneath the surface, the cost of his restraint became clearer when a new injustice reached him, not through rumor, but through a recording sent quietly by a friend who worked in radio. It was a late-night segment, meant to be humorous, where a popular host mocked immigrant mothers, exaggerating accents, reducing devotion to caricature, drawing laughter from an audience trained to find comfort in cruelty when it was wrapped in entertainment. The name Martin was not spoken, but the implication was obvious enough that it did not need to be. Dean listened once, then again, his face unchanged, though his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He thought of his mother, of how carefully she had spoken in public, aware that any misstep would be treated not as individual error, but collective proof. He thought of the church, of the quiet shame on the faces of those who had underestimated him, and he understood something with painful clarity. This was not about him being offended. It was about normalization, about how easily dignity could be eroded when mockery went unanswered. The injustice here was not personal. That made it more dangerous. Friends urged him to ignore it. Engaging, they warned, would only amplify the insult. Dean listened, nodded, thanked them for their concern. But silence, he knew, could be misread as agreement, and agreement was something he could not offer. The turning point did not come in a studio or a courtroom. It came in the form of a letter, handwritten, precise, and addressed directly to the station's board rather than the host himself. Dean did not demand an apology. He did not threaten legal action. He did not reference his fame. He wrote instead about responsibility, about how voices that reached millions shaped permission, and how laughter could be taught to punch downward without ever realizing it had been instructed to do so. The letter was read in a meeting that Dean did not attend. Those present described the room afterward as unsettled, not defensive, but exposed. The board members were accustomed to criticism, but this was different. It did not accuse them of malice. It assumed their capacity for better judgment. That assumption was disarming. Within days, the segment was pulled from rotation, replaced with an on-air acknowledgement that the content had failed to meet the station's standards. The host issued a stiff, scripted apology that satisfied no one completely, but the damage had been interrupted, and that mattered more. Dean never commented publicly. When asked in an interview weeks later about the incident, he redirected the conversation to music, to collaboration, to the idea that art should widen the room rather than shrink it. Those who understood heard the message beneath the restraint. Those who did not were not his audience anyway. What mattered was the shift, subtle but real, in how easily such jokes were made afterward. The laughter grew more cautious, the silence more attentive. Part 3 closed not with triumph, but with accumulation. Each quiet stand, each measured refusal, built something invisible but durable. Dean Martin did not change the world in grand gestures. He adjusted its balance by insisting, again and again, that dignity was not negotiable, whether in a church, a studio, or a late-night broadcast. And as he sat alone one evening, the rosary resting on the table beside him, he understood that grief had given him something unexpected. Not hardness, but clarity, the kind that does not shout, does not waver, and does not forget. When the lights felt harsher and the applause thinner, not because Dean Martin had lost his place, but because he had stopped cushioning other people's discomfort with his silence. The industry had learned to respect him, but respect does not always mean acceptance, and it was during the preparation for a nationally televised charity gala that the deeper stakes finally revealed themselves. The event was meant to honor American generosity, a polished evening where celebrities performed, donors smiled, and injustice was discussed only in abstract terms that required no accountability. Dean had agreed to participate months earlier, before grief sharpened his sense of truth, before restraint became something he chose rather than something he was expected to maintain. As rehearsals began, Dean noticed how carefully the evening had been curated. Stories of struggle were present, but sanitized, stripped of context, reduced to inspirational sound bites that made audiences feel kind without ever feeling responsible. Backstage, he overheard a conversation between organizers discussing which beneficiaries should be highlighted and which should be quietly omitted. One name belonging to a community organization serving immigrant families was dismissed with casual cruelty. Too political, one man said. Too specific, another added. The donors want to feel generous, not implicated. Dean did not interrupt. He listened, absorbing not just the words, but the ease with which they were spoken. The injustice here was structural, hidden behind velvet curtains and good intentions. It was not hatred, it was erasure, and erasure had always been more dangerous because it pretended to be neutral. Dean thought again of his mother, of how often her sacrifices had been invisible, her labor assumed rather than honored. He realized that this gala, dressed in elegance, was asking him to lend his credibility to the same quiet cruelty he had already refused elsewhere. The tension built slowly, not in confrontation, but in his growing awareness that participation itself could be a form of consent. On the night of the event, the auditorium filled with applause and expectation. Dean waited in the wings, tuxedo immaculate, expression calm, the image everyone trusted to keep things smooth. When his cue approached, a stage manager whispered the final instructions, reminding him to keep remarks brief, uplifting, non-controversial. Dean nodded, stepped into the light, and for a moment gave them exactly what they expected. He sang beautifully, his voice steady, familiar, a reminder of a time audiences associated with comfort rather than challenge. The applause was immediate, generous, relieved. Then, instead of exiting as planned, Dean remained at the microphone. The room quieted again, not with the hush of grief this time, but with curiosity. He did not accuse the organizers. He did not name names. He spoke instead about generosity as something that required sight, about charity that counted only when it acknowledged the full humanity of those it claimed to serve. He said that helping people without listening to them was not kindness, but convenience. His words were simple, carefully chosen, impossible to dismiss, without revealing exactly what they were protecting. There was no outburst, no visible rebellion, but the effect was immediate. Faces tightened. Applause hesitated. Somewhere in the audience, a donor shifted uncomfortably, realizing that their presence had been reframed not as virtue, but responsibility. Dean concluded by dedicating his performance not to the sponsors, but to the unnamed mothers who held families together without recognition, and then he stepped away from the microphone, leaving the sentence unfinished in the air. The aftermath was swift and silent. The organizers did not confront him publicly. They adjusted. Within days, the omitted organization was added to the beneficiary list, its representatives invited to speak at a follow-up event that suddenly received less press but more substance. Dean declined further comment, declined additional invitations, declined the chance to soften what he had said for the sake of relationships that now felt conditional. He had not destroyed the gala. He had exposed it. Part 4 did not end with celebration. It ended with recalibration. Dean Martin walked away from the spotlight that night with fewer illusions and deeper alignment. The industry could no longer pretend he was merely charming. He had become something more difficult to manage, a man whose calm made excuses impossible. And as he returned home, the silence around him was no longer punishment. It was space. Space to honor grief not by hiding it, but by refusing to let it be used as decoration. A reckoning that did not announce itself, the kind that settles slowly until it can no longer be ignored, and Dean Martin recognized it not as an attack, but as a test of endurance. The invitations that once flowed freely now arrived selectively, framed as tributes but burdened with conditions. Studios wanted his presence, but not his principles. Producers praised his professionalism while quietly asking that he keep future remarks lighter, safer, less reflective of personal conviction. It was never phrased as censorship. It was framed as concern for balance, for harmony, for audience comfort. Dean understood the language well. It was the same language that had once placed his mother's casket slightly off-center and expected gratitude in return. The deeper injustice emerged when a younger performer, the son of immigrant parents, came to him privately after a taping. The man spoke carefully, fear threaded through his voice, explaining how he had been warned not to emphasize his background in interviews, how jokes at his expense were dismissed as harmless, how refusal was interpreted as ingratitude. He asked Dean not for intervention, but for advice, for some indication that survival did not require erasure. Dean listened without interrupting, the weight of accumulated moments pressing quietly against his chest. This was no longer about correcting individual slights. It was about the inheritance of silence, passed down as wisdom when it was really resignation. Dean did not promise protection. He did not suggest rebellion. Instead, he invited the young man to dinner, not as a lesson, but as inclusion. They spoke about craft, about patience, about the difference between compromise and disappearance. Dean told him that dignity was not something granted by institutions, but something maintained internally, even when it came at a cost. He admitted, without bitterness, that the cost could be real, that doors might close, that approval might thin. But he also said that once you allowed yourself to be reduced, the world rarely volunteered to restore you. The injustice, he made clear, was not just what was done to you, but what you were expected to accept as normal. Word of that dinner traveled quietly, not as gossip, but as reassurance. Others began to approach Dean, not with complaints, but with questions. How had he lasted? How had he navigated an industry built on image without losing his center? Dean answered when asked, never publicly, never theatrically, always in measured conversations that left people steadier than when they arrived. The turning point came not through confrontation, but accumulation. A critical mass of artists began declining roles, rejecting scripts, adjusting contracts in small but coordinated ways that signaled awareness. The industry noticed, not as a threat, but as friction, the kind that slows momentum and forces reconsideration. Dean's decisive action in Part 5 was not a speech or a refusal, but a withdrawal. When offered a high-profile project that required public endorsement of narratives he no longer believed in, he declined without explanation. No counteroffer, no negotiation. The absence was louder than any statement. Executives speculated, columnists hinted, but Dean remained silent, continuing his work elsewhere, investing in projects that valued craft over conformity. The message was unmistakable. Access to him was no longer automatic. The resolution unfolded gradually. Studios adjusted their tone. Interviews softened. Younger performers found slightly more room to speak without being edited into palatable shapes. Nothing was transformed overnight, but something had shifted. Dean had not dismantled a system. He had removed himself from its most corrosive expectations, and in doing so, revealed how dependent it had been on his compliance. Part 5 closed with Dean alone in his home, late evening light casting long shadows across familiar walls. He held his mother's rosary again, not as a talisman, but as a reminder of lineage. Strength did not need an audience. Justice did not need applause. And dignity, once chosen repeatedly, became not an act, but a way of standing in the world. The way final reckonings often do, without ceremony, without warning, and Dean Martin understood almost immediately that this was not another battle to be navigated, but an ending that would define everything that came before it. The phone call came on an ordinary afternoon, the voice on the other end careful, respectful, carrying the kind of restraint people used when they knew they were speaking from a position that was no longer secure. A major network planned a retrospective celebrating American entertainment, a defining broadcast meant to shape how history would remember an era, and they wanted Dean at its center, not as decoration, not as nostalgia, as a pillar. But there was hesitation in the voice, a final condition framed as concern rather than control. They asked if he would be willing to keep the evening focused on joy alone, to avoid subjects that might make audiences uncomfortable, to let the past appear smoother than it had been. Dean listened without interruption, his expression calm, his breathing steady. He had lived long enough to recognize moments when silence was no longer neutrality, but complicity. The injustices he had encountered over the years had changed form, but not intent. They still asked certain people to shrink, to soften their truth for the sake of collective ease. He thought of his mother again, not as a symbol now, but as a presence, as the woman who had once corrected him gently when he tried to avoid conflict by laughing things off. "You do not owe comfort to those who benefit from your silence," she had said. "You owe yourself honesty." He declined the condition without raising his voice, without justification, without invitation to debate. He said he would participate only if the story told was complete, if the joy was allowed to exist alongside struggle, if dignity was not edited for convenience. The pause that followed was long enough for him to understand the weight of what he had done. This was not a negotiation. It was a line drawn cleanly and without resentment. Days passed. Rumors surfaced, softened versions of the truth circulating quietly through studios and press offices. Some said Dean was difficult now. Others said he was tired. The truth was simpler. He was finished explaining why respect mattered. When the network called back, their tone had changed. The condition was withdrawn. The retrospective would include the full arc, the immigrant stories, the quiet exclusions, the resilience behind the polish. Dean accepted, not with satisfaction, but with resolve. The night of the broadcast, the studio was filled with reverence rather than excitement. Dean sat beneath the lights, older now, composed as ever, his presence commanding without effort. When he spoke, he did not accuse the industry or glorify his own endurance. He spoke of mothers who were never photographed, of sons who learned restraint before they learned confidence, of success that meant little if it required forgetting who carried you there. His words were measured, unadorned, impossible to reduce into sound bites without losing their meaning. The audience listened, not because they were instructed to, but because something in his stillness demanded it. There was no dramatic applause at the end. There were no standing ovations timed for cameras. There was silence, deep and respectful, followed by something quieter and more lasting. Recognition, not of fame, but of integrity maintained over decades in a system that rarely rewarded it. The injustice that had once placed his mother aside, that had asked him to smile through erasure, that had relied on his compliance, had finally met its limit, not through force, through refusal. When the lights dimmed and the studio emptied, Dean walked out alone, carrying nothing with him but memory. Grief was still present. It always would be. But it no longer felt unfinished. His mother had been honored not just once, but repeatedly, through every moment he chose dignity over ease. Part 6 did not close with triumph. It closed with peace. The kind that comes only when a man knows he did not surrender himself for applause, and that the silence left behind him was not emptiness, but respect. Dean Martin understood that this was how it had to end. Years had passed since the broadcast, since the last quiet refusal that redefined how much of himself the world was allowed to borrow, and time had done what applause never could. It had clarified what remained when fame loosened its grip. Dean lived more privately now, not withdrawn, but settled, his days shaped by routine rather than reaction. He still sang, still worked, but the urgency was gone. What mattered had already been decided. One afternoon, unremarkable in every external way, Dean drove alone to a small cemetery far from studios and schedules. There were no reporters, no calls placed ahead of time, no attempt to make the visit meaningful to anyone but himself. He carried nothing with him except the rosary he had kept all these years, its beads worn smooth by habit rather than ritual. He stopped in front of his mother's grave and stood there for a long time without speaking. The silence was not heavy. It was familiar. It felt like home. He did not kneel. He did not bow his head dramatically. He simply stood, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady, the way she had taught him to stand in a world that often tried to make people smaller. In that stillness, memory did not arrive as regret, but as confirmation. He remembered the kitchen in Cleveland, the careful way she corrected him when he spoke too loudly, the insistence that respect was not something you demanded, but something you practiced until others had no choice but to recognize it. He realized then that everything he had done since her death had not been reaction or rebellion. It had been continuity. He had not become someone new. He had simply stopped editing the man she raised. A groundskeeper passed at a distance, nodding politely, not recognizing the figure standing there. Dean nodded back, equal and unremarkable in the best possible way. That anonymity felt earned. Fame had taken much from him over the years, but it had not taken his center. And now, in this quiet place, there was nothing left to defend. The injustices he had confronted had not vanished from the world, but they no longer defined his movement through it. He had drawn his lines. He had honored his dead. He had refused to become convenient. Before leaving, Dean placed the rosary gently at the base of the stone, not as surrender, but as completion. He no longer needed to carry it. The lesson had settled deeper than any object could reach. As he turned away, there was no final look back, no cinematic pause. Closure did not require acknowledgement. It simply existed. The story ends here not because the world was fixed, but because the man at its center was whole. Dean Martin did not destroy systems or demand applause for his restraint. He lived in a way that made cruelty uncomfortable and dignity unavoidable. And long after the music faded, after the screens went dark, what remained was not a legend polished by nostalgia, but a standard quietly set. One that asked nothing of the audience, except to notice how powerful silence can be when it is earned.